My goal has been from the beginning is to just try to share knowledge that people have with the public so that we can all kind of get a little more resilient to the changes that are happening around us. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alan Benoit. I'm a local architect, really focused on small energy efficient homes. That's probably the three things. Affordable is probably in there as well. Small energy efficient affordable homes. So I tried to start my presentation with a few things a little off topic. This was something that I photographed this past month. I was driving, I think this was on the New Hampshire side of the river. But it's an old snow plow train engine, I guess. But I was just really blown away by the 8-foot blade, and you can see the guard up top, kind of keeping the cockpit from getting hit by all the snow that must be flying by. And I really would love to see that thing in operation, but I don't think it's ever going to be again. And then we continued to explore Vermont. For the first time, we hiked to the Deer Leap, which is across the way from Pico Mountain. That's Pico in the background. That's me on Deer Leap. But if you haven't been there, it starts right down at the Inn at the Long Trail or something like that, and hikes up right around behind it. Pretty neat hike, short enough, and a really awesome view. So if you have friends visiting, or if you haven't been there before, definitely check it out. So the past 26 years, I've been keeping a garden journal. There's 10 years in each of these books, and I'm on my third one. I basically keep track of the weather, the temperature, what's happening in the yard, animals, bird sightings, all kinds of things like that, how much snow we're getting. So looking back, January 26th, in the last 26 years, we're usually around, I think, about 49, 50 inches of snow by this time. I only have recorded 34 inches this year. Last year we only had 10 inches. So to put that all in perspective, we've had temperatures as low as -22 today and as high as, I think, 45. And we got pretty close to that today as well. And I guess one of the things that I really have been in tune with is that it's usually when it's a sunny day and a clear night that it gets really cold. And it's usually a cloudy day, that could be stormy when it's warmer. So fortunately, if you're trying to generate electricity from the sun, those cold, clear nights where it's coldest, the sun is providing us extra sunlight during the day to kind of offset the associated heating costs. So that's one good way to look at, the weather is providing us the energy we need to get through those cold nights. So tonight we're going to talk about net zero homes. I had about 7 possible projects that I could have talked about tonight, and some of them would have been better and easier to talk about, but the 3 I picked are kind of a cross-section of the types of projects that you could be faced with when you're designing or renovating or deep energy retrofit of an existing house. So I'm trying to cover one of each of those topics. 2 of the case studies that I'm going to be talking about are actually second homes, so there's some challenge with doing all the math and converting how much usage there would actually be. But I did my best based on, I worked with Efficiency Vermont and I worked with the power company, and we tried to get what I estimate their usage would be. You'll see that it really doesn't matter because they're pretty darn close to net zero no matter what. So what is net zero? Does everybody know that already? Maybe not. So net zero is basically if you take all of your electrical costs over the year, electrical can include heating, and you compare it to all of your renewable energy generation If you add those two numbers up for the entire year, they should cancel each other out. So you get your electric bill every month. It shows your usage in kilowatts. And if you're at net zero, it's not just going to be, a $0, a zero bill every month. It's going to look something more like this, where it's going to compare, your generation versus your usage. So the orange being the usage, and you can see, in the peak of winter, we're using the most energy. It kind of tapers off in May and June. Then we get into the cooling season, so your energy usage rises again a little bit and then dips back down in the milder autumn weather. But the solar panels are kind of almost doing an inverse of that, not quite. But the days are really short right now, so you have very little opportunity to generate electricity. So this is a good example of if you're using solar, not necessarily wind. As the days get longer, you're going to be generating more and more electricity. We have sunnier periods during the summer, typically much longer days, definitely. So you're generating a lot more electricity at that time of year, and then it wanes off again come winter. So the goal is that if you add up all your usage over the year and you subtract all of your generation over the year, the area of those two is about equal. And the challenge with estimating or modeling anything is it's always wrong, right? Because it's just a guess. It's your best guess. Even if it's amazing software, we could have a winter like last winter that would just throw everything out of whack. So this is what you're striving for. It's never going to be perfect. So the good news is that solar prices are dropping quickly. Solar panel efficiency has been climbing constantly. We now have reliable cold climate air source and ground source heat pumps, and the energy code continues to get more and more strict. So therefore, your homes, especially new homes, any addition or renovation are getting much more efficient. So by increasing that efficiency, you're reducing how much energy you need, and then making solar much more affordable and more productive allows you to offset that cost much more easily. And the heat pumps are the ones that can actually use electricity to give you not just heating all winter, but air conditioning in the summer. So those three main elements together really make a difference. There's a push for net zero all over the world, really. In Vermont, we're trying to get 90% renewable by 2050. It sounds like, yeah, by 2050, that's a long ways off. But if you think about how many existing houses there are and how bad the existing housing stock is, how inefficient it is, that is really a challenge. We don't realize it, I don't think yet, but every time people sit back and look at the numbers, it's like, that's going to be a tough one to meet. Because that means most of the new houses are going to probably have to generate twice as much energy as they need to offset those leaky old drafty farmhouses we have, because they're losing 3 times as much energy. And then the AIA has the 2030 challenge. Does that look blurry? Yes. Is there any way we can focus that? Now that I see words up there, I'm like, So the AIA has the 2030 challenge, and they're trying to get all new construction to be carbon neutral by the year 2030. Carbon neutral and net zero, if you look at it in the big picture, it's about the same thing. And sunny Santa Monica with a nice mild climate, they're already demanding that every building, even if it's a multifamily, et cetera, is, as of 2016, net zero construction. And if I was designing houses in Santa Monica, I'd have no problem doing that. So in the past, we could get to net zero by doing something like this. There's been some, 5,000, 10,000 square foot net zero houses built out in California. But they would have, you know, a solar field like you see driving down the highway. They'd have some kind of electric heat. It could just be resistance heat. And they do a little bit of air sealing and some insulation, but nowhere near enough to really make it all make sense and make it affordable to everybody. What we're looking for is something more like this, where it's kind of a balance. The insulation, the air sealing, conservation of energy. We still need to use that electric heating and cooling, and then a smaller, more realistic renewable energy source, whether that's solar or wind. More and more solar seems to be winning out. And that's the sweet spot in the middle. If you can get all of those things balanced just right, you can achieve net zero. So I talk about insulation and, you know, how much insulation. The code is only like R19. You can still get by with R19. You know, nothing I build is R19. Do at least R21 in the walls, and I always do some kind of exterior insulation. I say to aim for R30, settle for R25, but make sure some of that is continuous exterior insulation. That gets rid of all your thermal bridging, makes a huge difference compared to the insulation that's squeezed between the studs and there's wood going all the way to the outside versus a nice warm blanket around everything. So, and then the ceilings, R60 is a good number to start with. Code right now is, I think, R38 still. I try to do at least R40 over the top plate, which is the edge of the wall, and try to get up around R60 when you get toward the center of the house. And then air sealing. So there's a lot of different ways to do air sealing depending on if you have an existing or a new structure. You know, if it's an existing basement, sometimes going in with spray foam gun is about all the options you have for sealing in that box sill. So those are basically the floor joists where you're standing on most of the time. That blue insulation you see is covering the concrete wall. So we can air seal. That's one of the leakiest places, and then sometimes, especially if you have a stone foundation or something like that, that can provide a lot of air leakage. Nowadays, we're doing most of the air sealing on the exterior, where we wrap the entire building in some kind of membrane. All the joints are taped, or it's a fully adhered membrane. I used to do this fully taped membrane, and now there's a fully adhered membrane available for the residential sector, so we've switched to that. So it just peels and sticks right on the building, so you don't have to tape all the seams and joints like you used to have to. So air sealing, how much air sealing? The code right now is less than three air exchanges per hour. I say aim for 1 air exchange per hour, and almost every project I've done is less than a third air exchange per hour. So reaching 1 shouldn't be a challenge, but it's definitely a good goal. Certainly we can do better than 3. So energy conservation, again, something that's getting easier and easier all the time. We have Energy Star appliances available readily almost on every front, whether it's dishwasher, washing machine, air conditioners, whatever. Programmable thermostat, I don't know who doesn't have a programmable thermostat, but if you don't, that's definitely one of the first things that can help you conserve energy. Let the house control the temperature, especially when you're gone. And then now LED lights, you know, at first they had some challenges, especially with the color rendering and things, but now they're getting much warmer and you can screw it into a regular socket. So LED lights, much more long lasting, much less energy usage. So as much conservation as you can stand. You know, my wife leaves a room, I go into that room and turn off the light. So you have to find that balance. So air source heat pump. So this is an example of 2 different size air source heat pump, one for upstairs, one for downstairs. There's this new, so this is the smaller one here and there. And then there's, typically you see them mounted high on a wall, especially in restaurants. But now they have some that are more like radiators that can be mounted lower down in the room. So when do you use an air source heat pump? Affordability is probably one of the reasons you would go with an air source heat pump over a ground source heat pump. They're probably about half the price, maybe a little less, to go with an air source heat pump. But I'd say, you know, if you're only going to be in a house for 5 or 10 years, air source heat pump will do just fine. If you're going to be there more than 10 years, the rest of your life, it's your retirement home, you might want to look into a ground source heat pump. It'll be worth the investment. It's going to cost more up front, but it's going to pay for itself 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road. So, and then, you know, why use this heating system instead of a propane furnace? You know, oh, and I can get a 97% efficient propane boiler. Well, these are 2 to 3 times more efficient than that. So that's why. So they take very little energy, they create a lot more heat, and they do it much more efficiently. There's no combustion. You don't have to ever worry about carbon monoxide. You know, if the system goes down, these are much more tried and true. They do have compressors. They do have some moving parts, so there will be some maintenance potentially, but much more efficient than propane or oil. Any questions? I'm coming up for air. All good? So if you want to go to the next level and one, you can afford it, you're going to be in the house longer than 10 years, certainly a ground source heat pump is what I recommend. Almost all of the projects I do nowadays are ground source heat pumps. 3 to 4 times as efficient as propane and oil. Air source heat pumps, because they're using the outside air, their efficiency changes. So if it's 40 degrees outside, you're going to get very good efficiency. But as that temperature starts to drop outside with an air source heat pump, it's going to start losing its efficiency. Ground source heat pump is working with wells that are drilled into the ground. The tubes actually get buried underneath. This is just temporary during construction. And then they get connected, you know, well under the frost line. But the ground temperature is much more constant than the air temperature, right? So it can be 90 degrees outside, it can be 30 below outside. The ground's always going to be between 45 and 55. So it's a much more stable, their efficiency is going to be much more reliable, much more predictable. So again, 10 years or more, and 3 to 4 times more efficient than oil or propane. So renewable energy, we talked about solar panels. Wind, wind certainly, there are still some good wind turbines out there. There's some good opportunities for wind. You have to have the right siting. I guess, you know, the biggest challenge with wind these days has been, you know, these larger farms on ridge lines. Sometimes they're owned by out-of-state entities, and they can cause concerns. But I say if you can put in a small wind turbine in your backyard, if you live on top of a ridgeline or a hill, that's not a bad idea, and not so controversial. Something else we don't want to forget is using passive solar. You know, that is still a heat source in the winter. You know, this is one of the passive solar houses I designed 10 years ago maybe. But, you know, big overhangs so that in the summertime it's shading, but big windows on the south side, so in the wintertime it's heating up. So that is still considered to me a renewable energy because you're using the energy from the sun, just not using it to create electricity. So I don't know if I mentioned, but I had 7 projects and I had to whittle it down to 3 for tonight. So hopefully you can bear with me and understand why I chose these 3 projects in the end. But I wanted to show one of each type of project, and these were the 3 best that I had and the most data that I had. Not every client is willing to tell you everything they paid to do a renovation, or how much their electrical bill is, or how much they paid for their solar. So I had pretty good information on these 3. So the first one, this is a deep energy retrofit. This is actually a 2-level condo on Bromley Mountain. So it was or is used not full-time, so keep that in mind, but we'll get to that in the end. But as you can see, it had some issues on the outside. Actually, we already started the renovation here because I can see those are serious windows, so those are triple pane windows on the north side. But it's a 2,040 square foot, 2-level condo. This is the first deep energy retrofit that I was involved in. On the outside, it needed help. There was a huge air leak right under here. That's all spray foam underneath the rotted sill of this slider. Old aluminum sliding doors, very inefficient. So it had issues on the outside, but the owners also wanted to take care of some issues on the inside. You know, it was definitely due for an upgrade. That's actually a new refrigerator, or newer, and even, you know, the bathroom. So they owned this condo, they lived in it for a few years, and they said, okay, we've got to do something to make it better. So every good deep energy retrofit starts with demolishing things right back to the studs. That way you can make the best use of spaces, and you can run your heating systems and wires, etc. But also you can insulate much better. So this was the project where we used spray foam to insulate the box sills. We put our 10 on the inside of the concrete wall, so that's 2 inches of that blue foam there. So a little aside, a foot thick of a concrete wall is R1. And as you drive around town, everybody's house, you can see about that much of their foundation all the way around their house. So their windows are more efficient than their foundation. So by going from R1 to R11, you know, it's what, 1,000 times better, you know? So just putting 2 inches of insulation on concrete is a big step in the right direction. And also here we used a lot of spray foam. Again, it was an existing structure. We were trying to get air sealing and insulation all in one. And there aren't too many products that can do that quickly and efficiently. There was an option here for, we actually, because they had a cathedral ceiling, we were able to add some thickness to the ceiling and add a little extra insulation in the cathedral ceiling, which is kind of back here in that space. They also had some water leakage in the chimney, so they were going right through this thing and bringing it up. So we did a ground source heat pump here. So this is, I can't remember, I think it's 6 years or 7 years ago. Oh, it says 2010 on there. There it is. 6 or 7 years ago. So again, ground source heat pumps, the way they work is they basically have almost like a furnace that you would have in your basement, and they're of varying sizes. So one way that you can save money is to make that appliance as small as possible, because the smaller it is, the more affordable it gets. So when we were doing the calculations with the installer, they said, you know, we're going to use this size unit because you have this much heat loss and you only have this much insulation. So I was like, okay, what would it take for us to go to the next smaller size? And he's like, well, you have to get the heat loss down to this much. So I did a little bit of math and we figured out, okay, that would be, you know, 3 more inches of insulation in the ceiling. So we just took, you know, 2x4 studs and sistered it onto the existing ceiling joist. We got 3.5 more inches of insulation. The insulation cost, I don't know, it was an extra, you know, $2,000. We saved $7,000 on the heat pump alone, and they're gonna save, you know, whatever it is, $14 a year for the rest of the existence of the house. So we more than paid for the insulation, more than paid for the insulation by downsizing the heat pump, and now their energy bill is actually gonna be a little less because you're not using this bare to heat, you know, a small space. So sometimes just going back and forth a little bit to see where we can tweak can save everybody money right up front. So this is what a heat pump looks like inside the building. You can tell it's 6 or 7 years ago because this is a brand new electric water heater. That's what we were using back then. Nowadays I would recommend an air source heat pump water heater, but that technology wasn't quite reliable back 6 or 7 years ago. So this is what a heat pump looks like. This is kind of the workhorse here. It's works very much like a refrigerator or air conditioner. Heat comes in one side, cold air goes out the other, whether it's being exhausted outside in the wintertime and heat's going inside, or vice versa in the summertime. But compressed gas is very much like what your refrigerator, freezer, and air conditioner work like. So before the renovation, the snow would just melt, right? The whole roof would melt, snow would fall off. They were having big issues with ice damming, so as the snow, the roof is so warm that the snow is melting underneath, and this snow on top is insulating that, so it's exasperating it. So the more snow cover you have, the more this ice dam will build up, so it's just melting and freezing, melting and freezing. And what actually happens is eventually that starts melting and coming inside the walls. When I first moved into our house, we had that issue. We no longer have that issue. So this is the house after the renovation. We actually put on, it made a lot of sense being in ski country, to have a little mud room. That also kept the door from getting dumped on snow, and you can see there's no ice damming at all. This is probably a little bit more snow than the last photograph, but nice continuous coating, no icicles. So again, this is a 2,040 square foot house, and we got 535 CFM. The house I live in now, even though I've spent at least 5 serious years air sealing, I'm still at, I think, over 1,900 CFM. So, almost 4 times this air leakage in my house. So we really tightened this up well. That comes out to, if you do the math, that comes out to about 1/3 of an air exchange per hour. So you have to multiply this times the height of the spaces to get the cubic volume, and then divide it by that, and you get the air exchanges per hour. So we're about 1/3 of an air exchange. And Jim Hand's son did the blower door test on this, and he said that it was I haven't tested anything this tight so far, so good job. So this was the tightest house that he had ever tested at that time, which was a good place to be. So here's their energy usage. So now keep in mind, this is a second home, but they're here just as much in 2004 through 2010 as they are from 2010 to 2016. So you can see clearly that we went from about 3,000 kilowatt hours per month down to about 600 on average. So that's a huge percentage. I think it's something like 82% reduction in their heating bills. And this is heating, cooling, air conditioning, hot water. It's a 100% electric house. So that's including their plug loads and everything like that. So if I adjust it, I tried to do the best I can. I talked to the client. I asked them how many days they're here, what temperature they keep the house set at. It's interesting, a lot of these second homeowners keep their house at 55 or 60 when they're not here, which is surprising to me. I always thought like 40, 45 was the norm, but I guess not. And maybe because it's, a ground source heat pump, it's not very expensive, so they can do that. So with all that in mind, I adjusted it. The calculations came out to about an 18%. They would use about 18% more energy if they were here full time than what they currently do. So that's what that red line is representing. So that goes up to about 720 kilowatt hours per month. So if they had chose to go the next step, and again, this is 6 or 7 years ago, and had put solar panels on the roof, which they didn't, but they could still. So I calculated it would take about 20 solar panels to do it. That's about $23,000 installed. If they were Vermont residents, they could get a 30% tax credit off of that. And that would be about a 10-year return on investment. So if we're talking it's already been 6 or 7 years, and had they done it 6 or 7 years ago, 3 or 4 years from now, they will have broken even. And then from that point forward, they get free heating for life, free cooling for life. Yes, Jim?
Just curious, with that being such a tight house, at what point do you start getting concerned about ventilation?
We did put in an HRV. Yep. And I didn't put the picture, but we do have an HRV in there. So it is, HRV is a heat recovery ventilator, for those of you who don't know. And what that does is that takes fresh air from outside, it bypasses it with warm, stale air from inside. They exchange their heat. In doing so, the fresh air comes in preheated, the stale air goes outside. So HRV, anytime we're doing tight construction like this, we put in an HRV. Yes?
Is the federal tax credit phased out completely now?
No, it has been extended 5 years, fortunately, by the skin of its teeth. So 5 more years for that federal tax credit, 30%. Yep. And then there is a, Green Mountain Power will pay you full rate of whatever energy you produce, and then if it's on site, they'll add 4 more cents. So it's usually about 14.9 cents or something like that per kilowatt hour. They'll add, there's a bonus 4 cents an hour. It used to be 5 cents, and now it's down to 4. But fortunately, the 30-year tax credit survived for another 5 years. So that was a deep energy retrofit. So an existing house, we didn't really change the footprint. We added a little bit of a bump out. So we increased the square footage by 30 square feet. We still reduced their heating and cooling and electrical by 82%. So that's, if you have an existing house, what can you do? And that's the kind of thing you can do. And I think they could be net zero if they wanted to invest. They've already invested well more than $23,000 in that building, you know, investing a little bit more, 10% more than the project costs. In 10 years, they could be net zero, or they could have no more heating bills. So this is project number 2. This is a little bit more of an addition renovation type project. So if you had an existing house, in this case it's an existing farmhouse that had a little bit of an addition off of it that was totally dysfunctional. So this would be case study 2, kind of an addition plus a little bit of, we kind of did some energy upgrades at the same time. So that's what the plus was. So this is the little wing that I was talking about. It had the master suite in there. The challenge was that it was very poorly built. It was on a partial foundation. Parts of the subfloor were rotting. There were 3 different levels, and the owner has issues walking. So having those 3 different levels to step up and step down and step up again to get around was really getting to be a chore. So it was a good opportunity not only to rebuild something that was kind of falling apart, but it was also to make it safer, and this is going to be their retirement home, so to make it so that they can live in it permanently. So it started, we actually deconstructed the building. So we took off, you know, the existing slate. We actually reused the slate on the house. We saved some of the wood. Some of the windows got put in a barn, which you'll see later. So we tried to deconstruct it as best we could and salvage what we could. So this is where the addition used to be. So we removed the old foundation, bits and pieces, and we prepared the site. I'm going to go through these a little bit quick. And then we poured a insulated concrete foundation. Any new foundation I always do an insulated concrete foundation. There's a little detail of it right here. So it's going to end up being 4 inches of concrete on the exterior, 4 inches of concrete on the interior, and 4 inches of insulation in the middle. And that's fireproof, termite proof, and if you have the insulation on the interior, you always have to finish it with something, so that avoids you having to do that. So the insulation is protected from everything on both sides, and it gives, the way we detail it, it gives a continuous thermal envelope because that continues right under the slab. So the slab insulation actually touches the wall insulation, goes up, touches the wooden wall insulation, and continues around. You can see how we actually extended the foam up here, and that's so that it could actually go into the wall and continue right up through. And then we did the air sealing. So this is a vapor permeable air and weather barrier. So it keeps out air and wind-driven rain, but if there were moisture behind it, it has pores that opened up and allows the moisture to escape. And then we wrapped the entire building in insulation. In this case, it was 2 inches of Roxul. So this is a rock wool insulation. So it's not like fiberglass, but it is. But it's made out of spun pumice, I think, and lava rock. And it is compressed. And it's not pumice, it's something else, but I'll remember it. But it's compressed into these sheets. And again, it used to be available only commercially, and now it's available residentially. And then we attach it with wide strapping, so that's what this is. This is all strapping. Strapping allows the siding to breathe and dry out between rain events. Will keep the paint on your siding much longer. So we were at about R29 total, if you don't count the sheathing, which there is in the sheetrock and all that. So we're probably in the R31, 32 range for whole wall value. And then this is the heat pumps that we installed. Initially, this is like a little reading nook that's kind of off at a 45, but it created this perfect little negative nook to put the heat pumps in, so they're well protected and well ventilated. So it worked out well to tuck them in there. And now this is the new addition completed. So again, we reused the slate there. This is all one level from this existing house all through this, and then it's a step down into the garage. So as you can see back here, there's maple trees all around this house. So putting solar on the house really wasn't a wise investment, but they did need a garage. This is more of a place to keep their tractor, ATV, stuff like that. So we were able to put this out in the sunny meadow, facing perfectly due south, cover it with solar panels. So they have 33 solar panels on here. And this is their actual data from there. So the orange is their current usage for the year, or the past year, and the green is their solar panel production. So you can see without...
Are those air source?
Air source heat pumps, yep. So without too much of a challenge, they were able to generate, you can tell that's definitely generating more than they're using, right? So they're here 100 days a year, so that's like a third of the year. So what I did is I tried to rework the numbers. So this is those same numbers adjusted. I increased it 33% because I figured, doing the math, they keep the air source heat pumps at 60 degrees, and they keep the old part of the house at 50 degrees. So doing the math, it came up to about 33% higher heating and cooling and electrical bills. And you can still see that they're outproducing, it's about 1.5 to 1. So what that shows to me, and this was kind of the idea all along, is they still have the opportunity, the old part of the house, while it's connected and there's heat traveling to and from the old part and the new part, the old part still has an oil furnace in it because there are some rooms upstairs that need to be heated and some corners around the way that are hard to get to. So there is still fossil fuel being burned. So they have the option, I'd say, if they're producing 50% extra, they probably have the option that they could put another air source heat pump in that existing building and get rid of their oil furnace altogether, and they'd still be net zero. And to me, that's pretty cool, because that array on that barn doesn't look too out of place. It fits in pretty well with the landscape, and it's producing twice what they need now. But if they moved up here full time and converted their existing house from oil to electricity, they'd probably be net zero, if not a little better. Any questions on that project? Yes?
Is it correct that you don't get a credit if you produce more than you use?
Correct. So
It must be on an annual basis?
Yep, so the way it was until December 31st was that if you produced, let's say you produced $5,000 worth of solar energy and your heating bill was $5,000, I mean your electric bill was $5,000, including monthly fees, they would cancel each other out over over the course of 12 months, any 12 months. Now what has happened is that they cannot cancel out your monthly fee. So there are certain fees on your billing statement, almost like your cable bill, phone bill. There are some bills that you can never get rid of, and that's going to be one of them now. So moving forward, you'll always have that $30 charge a month or whatever it is for being connected to the electrical grid. And even though you could be net zero energy-wise, you're still going to have a $30 electrical bill every month.
But you cannot be a minus on your production. You can't get a credit on the electric production.
Right. Your credit for your extra production can never go towards that $30 a month. But you could totally offset 100% of your electrical use. Yes?
The ground coupled system that you showed in the previous installation, was that for a hot water system or an air system within the house?
So the ground source heat pump from the first project, that is for a air. So typically ground source heat pumps are generating warm air that is getting sent around through ducts, and it has returns much smaller than what you're used to with a hot air furnace, but very much the same principle. Yes?
The point at which an air heat point does not produce when it gets cold enough.
So an air source heat pump will stop producing energy, they say at around negative 13 degrees, the cold climate heat pumps. I've seen one operating just fine at negative 22 last winter, and it did for two nights. It was 22 below and 23 below, and it kept running. So I don't know if there was it was protected in some way, so it wasn't feeling the full brunt of it, but it was still putting out heat at negative 22 and 23 degrees.
If not, you need to keep your backup in your house.
Say that again?
If it doesn't work at low temperature, you still need to have your backup.
Yes, yes. So this year I think we've only had 3 nights below zero, and it was in December. But usually this is the coldest time of our winter, these next 5 weeks. And I forget what the percentage is, but it's something like less than 1% of the time, basically, we're below that negative 13 degrees. So if your house is well insulated enough, you can coast through those nights. And the temperature is going to climb up again once the morning comes after the sunrise. You could certainly have electric radiant mat or something like that in your bathroom or your mud room to work as a reserve. You could have a propane fired gas insert, a fireplace insert or something like that if you really needed a backup. Yes.
When you get close to that theoretical 13 degrees, do you still produce the same amount of heat, or is that less?
So the question was, when it gets colder, how much heat do you still produce? I'm not an expert on heat pumps, so I will answer it the best I can. I know the efficiency goes down, so I think you're still producing some heat, but it's taking more and more energy basically to give you that same output of heat. But I'm guessing that their heat output is probably dropping as well, so their BTU output is probably dropping as well at that time. But again, for the few nights a year that it gets that cold, typically what's going to happen is it's going to be 65, 68 degrees in your house the last time the heat pump works. If the temperature dropped to 30 below and the heat pump doesn't turn on, your house is going to be able to coast for hours, if not days, if it's well insulated. So a good air-sealed, well-insulated house should be able to get you through any night that's less than negative 13 degrees. And I'm sure the technology is constantly improving. So before it was something like 18 degrees above zero was the cutoff point. And now we're 30 degrees colder than that. So 10 years from now, we might be able to get down to negative 50 and still generate some heat. So I don't know where the technology is headed and how fast it's going to get there. But certainly in the last 10 years, it has, the baseline temperature has continued to get lower and lower. Yes?
Retrofitting an existing concrete foundation you've been able to, of course, start with new construction from the bottom up. If you're trying to retrofit, is it worth putting insulation down to the freeze line on the outside for the part that's most exposed to the coldest temperature?
So the question is, if you're insulating an existing foundation, is it worth putting the insulation on the exterior?
Yeah.
I would suggest putting it on the interior, just because I have photographs of this. Ants do love blue foam, especially when it gets wet. So they'll nest in it and they'll shred it up pretty good like Swiss cheese. Weed whackers go through it in a heartbeat. Anything that gets thrown from a lawnmower will penetrate it. So it's much better to have it in a protected, controlled environment of inside if you can. Especially if it's a concrete foundation. Usually it's pretty smooth and you can put the rigid foam right on the walls. That's definitely the easiest place to do it. And then you have to, again, bridge that gap of the box sill. So that can either be done with spray foam or cellulose. There's a lot of options for there. Yes, you had a question.
With an existing house, what does it take to get air heat pumps or ground heat pumps into an existing house with the ducting and all that stuff?
So an air source, the question was, what does it take to get a air source or ground source heat pump into an existing house? And the air source heat pump is probably the easiest thing to retrofit because the compressor, as you saw, just mounts on the outside of the building. And then there are refrigerant lines, so they're small, thin tubing, basically, that runs inside your house, and then there'll be a head, typically on the wall, that will be giving off the heating and the cooling. So that would be the easiest to retrofit. You could do it with if you had like a hot air furnace that already had ductwork, and you had ductwork running through your house, then the ground sourced heat pump, you could at least use, if not the same ductwork, you could at least use where the ducts were to run the new ductwork. But that's usually a challenge with a ground source heat pump, is that it physically needs ductwork. And if you currently have, baseboard radiators or something like that, you don't have the places for those ducts to go. Good questions, thank you. All right. And then project number 3 is new construction. And again, I was in the air on which way I should go with this. I have a few houses that are currently under construction that I could have shown. This one happens to be a multi-purpose barn. And again, hopefully you'll bear with me and understand why I chose this. So it was a derelict old barn, already existing barn that was starting to collapse. It was way oversized. I think it was like 90 or 120 feet long and 40 or 50 feet wide. But that was getting torn down. And the homeowner wanted something that better fit their needs of what they're using the barn space for today. So we built a much smaller barn. This one's 30 by 60 feet, but it has space for animals. It has a place for cold storage, like a root cellar. It has a large heated garage for working on tractors and vehicles. It has a yoga studio. It has a food processing kitchen and storage area. So talk about multi-purpose. It's got, a lot of functions going on. Some spaces are well insulated, some spaces are not insulated. So this building is, I think, 2/3 insulated, and it's 3,600 square feet, just to give you an idea. We didn't go with the insulation in the concrete because when we first designed it, it was just going to be, the garage space was going to be insulated, and then it got a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger. But we figured we'd just insulate under the garage slab, and that would have been enough. It didn't make sense to, insulate this 10, 15 foot tall wall, and et cetera. So that's why we chose different wall system for this project. So insulating the inside, again, we filled the walls, so that's R21 dense pack cellulose, We did R60 in the ceiling, a little bit more in some places. We wrapped the outside. This project, because it's a multi-purpose barn, it's not really a house, we still wrap the outside with 1.5 inches of the rigid mineral wool insulation board. Double strapped because it's going to be a vertical siding. Typically, if it's clapboards, it'd just be single strap. There's a few places where you can see we use that blue, that blue lines there. Those are the self-adhered membrane. So we wrapped the whole building before insulation. We wrapped it in the self-adherent membrane. So that's the weather-resistive barrier, the air barrier, and it's fully adhered. So it can wrap into the windows. Again, we used a ground source heat pump. I should have written down the sizes of some of these, but one heat pump, one well, I think does the entire building, the heated portion of the building. It's going to be heating and air conditioning for, let's say, maybe 2,500 square foot area. Do I have time for an aside? Quick aside, on this project, we drilled the well for the heat pump. Now, we drilled the well for the water first, and we had a dowser come out, and the dowser identified very, very, very well where, how deep, how much flow, within 10%. He did an amazing job. And then they went to go, and we were getting, I forget what it was, say 30 gallons per minute. It was 22 gallons per minute coming out of the well. Then they went to go drill the well for the ground source heat pump. It was maybe 20 feet away from where they drilled for the well. And they can only measure, I think, 360 gallons per minute, and it was exceeding that. So that second well, which we were using for the ground source heat pump, probably could have been a bottling plant in itself. So there's still some work going on inside. This isn't the final door. That's probably the final paint color. But you can see we've got 51 solar panels on here. This is due south facing. You can see there's more windows on the south side than any other side. So it's passive solar as well as active solar. And it's already been spinning the meter in reverse. And this is why. So the barn we're estimating is going to use about 600 kilowatts per month. And the solar panel production is close to 1,600. But again, this is just a multi-purpose barn. About 100 feet away is the house. So they're going to take that excess, whatever it is, 1,000 kilowatt hours, put it towards the house. But the house is heated with wood, so they have very low usage there. They actually own a business as well. And the cool thing about net metering is, as long as your electrical company is the same for your house, your barn, and your company, even if one's in Burlington and one's in Bennington, you can still transfer those electron credits to that bill. So they're not only net zero for the barn, net zero for the house, but they're actually able to pay towards the business. It's a pretty big business. They can't net zero the whole business as well. But again, a good project showing that a barn sited in a location that can put on solar panels can more than net zero the house and the barn itself. Yes?
There's one well for that barn. And how deep is that well? Geothermal has one well.
Yeah, so it depends on the heat load. Typically, that's the restrictor is the heat load.
But for that project?
I believe it's one. It might be 2 wells. So what happens a lot is it really depends on what kind of bedrock they hit, if they hit bedrock or not. So we have another project that we're working on. So the first project up in Bromley, that was 1 well, 440 feet deep, bedrock the whole way, beautiful, great ground coupling. This project, I believe it was 1 well, and it was in the 500-foot range, something like that. It might have been 2 wells at 300 feet or something like that. But I have another project that I'm working on where a much bigger project, 3,800 square feet, and it is, they were predicting that they would need 3 wells, but because there's no bedrock at all, it gets very expensive because they have to put in the steel casing for wherever there isn't bedrock. So they're up to 5 wells there, but they're only like 200-foot wells. So they have 5 shallow wells instead of 3 much deeper wells. And that was mostly to try to offset the cost of the casing versus the drilling. So you never know what you're going to run into when you're drilling into the ground. Sometimes you run into thousands of gallons of water, and sometimes you run into mud.
Open loop groundwater?
Nope. So all of the ground source heat pumps are typically around here are closed loop systems. So that means that the furnace that sits in the basement is, a lot of times it has glycol in it as well. So the liquid glycol and water goes from that system through the foundation wall, 6 feet underground, out to the well, down to the bottom. There's actually a little U at the bottom, and it comes back up out of the well. So it's exchanging heat all the way down 500 feet and back up 500 more feet, and then through the ground as well. So closed loop system, meaning that all of the water that goes down and comes back is staying in that pipe, versus an open loop system further south where there's ponds that don't freeze, et cetera, or rivers or lakes. You can actually, almost like what a nuclear power plant does, you take in cold water, you heat it up a little bit, and you dispel or send out the warmer water. But typically closed loop systems. So a good design and planning, you can balance all of these elements, and I feel that net zero is truly attainable. I showed you a couple of projects where they're producing twice and 3 times what their current need is. And again, it's always a challenge to get that sweet spot, but with a little bit of calculations and a lot of luck, you can get there. And I just figured I would kind of recap, and I'd try not to put text up on my slides, but in this case, there was a lot of numbers that I was throwing out there, and I thought it would be good to just recap. So insulation walls, I usually do R30, ceiling R60. We're not talking, 10-foot walls, 10-foot thick insulation. It's all reasonable. Air sealing, less than 1 air change per hour, so that's how much air leakage there is. And then solar power, I worked with Bill LaBerge on this, but he said a 5 kilowatt system, if your electric bill is currently $100 a month, on average, a 5 kilowatt system will offset that. And a 5 kilowatt solar array is $18,000 installed before the tax credit. Again, these are rough numbers, and there are always circumstances that change these, so don't hold me to everything. But $12,600 after a 30% tax credit, and you'd be getting a 10% return on investment. Can anybody go to the bank today and get 10% on the money that they deposit? Right? 3% if you're lucky, 1% probably a lot of cases, but never 10%.
How many panels is 5 kW?
Good question. I think it's like 16, but I'm not positive. So it's somewhere around 300 kilowatts per panel, 260, 290, something like that. So an air source heat pump is twice as good as propane. Ground source heat pumps 3 times as good. But again, the price can be, the initial cost up front can be a little bit challenging for some to keep it affordable. Yes?
What does it cost to run a heat pump, electricity-wise, for
What?
an average house?
It costs, so what it costs to run a heat pump for an average house, that's a really tough question. So, if you're spending $500 a month on oil or propane, you can expect to be paying $200 or $150 or even $100, depending on which air source or ground source heat pump you go with. Again, I was working with Efficiency Vermont, and they were basing everything on a 2,500 square foot house. And I've had a project that was, 1,500 and 2,000 and 3,800. So it's really hard to convert those numbers because they're not really one for one. A bigger space is actually less expensive to heat than a smaller space. Per square foot.
If you change the propane to heat pump, how much
Yep.
more money will your electricity run that pump that you don't spend on propane?
Right, oh, I got your question now, yeah. I don't know that off the top of my head, but I do have clients who have an air source heat pump, and it is costing them, I think it's $380, or maybe it's around $480 a year for all of their heating and cooling. So if that helps, some of that is electricity, or I guess all of that's electricity. So 360 would be $30 a month. So maybe it's $40 a month or less to run it. Yes.
I was wondering, how do you calculate if you're, let's say, insulating the attic, I don't know, it's like cellulose and foam, like roughly the same price, or?
No, so the question was, how do you decide which insulation you use when you're insulating an attic?
By the square foot, like, how do you determine the cost?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Insulation is kind of a labor of love. Labor is probably half the cost of a lot of the insulation techniques that get done. So, spray foam insulation is probably going to cost a little bit more to have installed, but it's also air sealing, so there's some benefits to using that if you're retrofitting an existing space. If you're building new, then you can certainly air seal some other way, like with that Blue House wrap or something else. So if you're doing an existing house, I'd say fiberglass is the cheapest insulation, probably installed, not necessarily the best. Dense
Sheets of fiberglass,
yeah, yep,
but like for an attic space, you would do that?
you can, yep. But
There's some, like it's an old house and it's got like this gravelly stuff, which is very ineffective, and that picture of the roof with the slate and all the icicles, that's like my house.
yes, yes. So a lot of that can be heat loss through air leakage. So one of the best ways to take care of that is you would remove the existing insulation, whether it's pushing it aside a little bit at a time or not. Air sealing, so going with a little spray foam gun or something like that, filling. Also where all the wires are coming through and all the duct work and all that, so there's air sealing everywhere. And then putting insulation down and thickening it as best you can. But
I mean, like glaciers will form, snow, and it just ended up like cavitating these huge chunks falling. It's really.
yeah, so icicles are a sign that you certainly have heat loss through your ceiling, and glaciers are.
To begin with that, or to do the basement area, like the old part of the house, stone, joists and all that, and it's just that insulation foam, or that probably, fiberglass, or whatever that, sort of fabric-y stuff.
Yep. So where do you start? I'd say you start wherever you can do it yourself, because that'll be the most cost effective. So if you feel confident that you can insulate your own attic or air seal your own attic, that's where I would start. But then if you had to do something that you couldn't do yourself, that's when I would probably get an energy audit is probably the best way. Okay, and an energy audit, they'll identify where your lowest hanging fruit is, where the worst air leakage is, where your worst heat loss is, and you kind of target those items first. So they might, if you have a stone rubble foundation, you might be losing a lot more energy through there than you are through your roof.
What if it's below ground? Doesn't like just the ground have an insulated property?
Yes, so the area that is below ground does have some insulation, the ground insulation, but the ground does freeze, so it does provide some insulation from the air temperature. It's mostly the top 2 to 4 feet that are exposed that are going to have the most air leakage and heat loss in your foundation. I'm just going to wrap this up, I got just a couple more slides, and then we'll get to more questions. So that's all that. So you can certainly have, no heating bill, no cooling bill, no electrical bill. I think that anybody can become net zero. And I hope the examples I showed you were close enough to reality that you can relate to them. Again, I was trying to get a broad range of projects. And I think building net zero totally makes sense, especially if you're building a new house. That's when it makes the most sense, especially if it's a retirement house, because you're going to be in there for years and years and years. So that's the best time to do it. If it's a house that you're living in and you have to put $200,000 in to renovate it and you're only going to be there for 3 more years, that's not the time to go to net zero. But retirement house is definitely the time. All right, back to questions.
In your opinion, what's the better insulation for a health perspective wise, with the air exchange, without?
So the magic wall system that I use on all my projects are in the wall cavities. I use dense packed cellulose, and then outside I use the rock wool insulation, the dense rock wool insulation with strapping. There are a lot of advantages to that, not just the health benefits, but it allows air to move and moisture to move in both directions so that you're never worried about trapping moisture in your walls. The rock wool board is actually fireproof, so there's some benefits to that, especially over like the blue foam insulation. If you have that on the outside of your house and your house catches fire, it gives off poisonous gas. Firemen have a hard time dealing with that stuff because it actually burns much hotter and faster than wood would. So.
I just mean passively every day, just breathing.
Yep. Yeah, so my go-to insulations for health concerns are probably the cellulose and the Roxol.
The white insulation of polyiso, same or whatever, is that same hazard as the blue? Or is that the same
So yeah,
fire issue?
yep. I don't know if you were ever a teenage boy that tried to burn everything, but styrofoam cups burn really well. And that's what the white insulation is, that same styrofoam. So it's basically, it's a oil-based product that all foams are made out of, both the white and the blue.
So how do you, with that sheets of white or blue insulation, I assume you nail them up to your sheet. How do you put the rock wool up on the outside? Is it the same process?
Very similar process. There is a little bit of compression. I might give a presentation just on how to do this. But we've been working on a system. So I don't know if you saw in the pictures, but we're using like 4-inch wide strapping. So that helps spread the load so it doesn't compress as much, so you don't get the waviness. You do it with screws instead of nails so that you can back it out if you need to. But we actually, the project I'm working on right now, the builders all we all put our heads together. We came up with different systems. The builders came up with the best system. They actually have, the insulation's 3 inches thick. They have a 3-inch wooden dowel. They have a power pencil sharpener. They sharpen them. They stick the dowel. The point goes through the insulation. It's got a square tip on it, so it stops at the sheathing. And then it's 3 inches long, so when they put the strapping over that, it holds the strapping in place. So that seems to be the fastest, most cost-effective, easiest way to use that insulation.
Is the rock wool 2 feet wide?
4 foot by 8 foot sheets. So 2 years ago, RK Miles was not a stocking dealer, so you could only get it in 2 foot by 3 foot sheets. And I was trying to ask all these contractors to start using this product and trust me and blah, blah, blah. And if they're using all these little sheets to do the whole project, it gets time consuming. So I've worked with RK Miles, and they're now a stocking dealer of the Roxol insulation. So they have it in stock, 4 by 8 sheets in all different thicknesses. So, questions?
Limitations on the interior configuration for air source heat pumps. Are there any rules of thumb in terms of how big in square feet you could service from a single head or really?
So limitations on an air source heat pump. Open floor plans work really well with air source heat pumps if you have a lot of small chopped up rooms or if you have doors that will be closed most of the time. You probably have to put a dedicated head in that room. So open floor plan works best. And then if you're building to the current Vermont Energy Code, you could probably do 2,000 square foot with a single head if it was open enough. But sometimes there's reasons why you want multi-heads. There's a question further back? Yes.
Alan, do you think in our climate that it's possible, with pushing the margin with passive design, to have a house that doesn't require a heating system?
Absolutely. I am Passive House certified, and we did have a presentation maybe 3 years ago on Passive House, but literally a Passive House has no heating system. But you cannot get almost to Passive House. You either have no heating system or you have to have a heating system, and that's the challenge, is being able to jump off that cliff and trust the calculations and the insulation and using passive solar. So absolutely, you could be easily net zero with a Passive House. But we are talking, 16 inches of insulation on the concrete side, 12 inches of insulation in the walls, R80 in the roofs, R100 sometimes. So if you're willing to go to those extremes with the building envelope, then certainly. My instructor who came over, brought Passive House over from Germany, she has the power go out, for days at a time in Minnesota. And she says, if it gets chilly, I light 4 candles. So that shows you, what a difference a super well-insulated, airtight, and some of the things that I've learned from that is the continuous insulation all the way around, so no thermal bridging all the way around the building. So that certainly helps.
$40,000 you spend on that ground source heat pump to buy a lot of insulation.
Correct. You could. Yep.
What, in today's economy, what's the smallest solar array that makes any sense? And coupled with that is a wooded lot. You have a house lot, 2 acres. It's got a bunch of trees around. You only have so much opportunity.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yep. So here I am talking about net zero and solar panels, and I don't have a single solar panel on my house. Okay? Confession. My house has a 12-12 pitch slate roof. They cannot put solar panels on slate roofs. The only portion of my house that faces south is all slate. The next best thing that I could do was to put it on a studio that we have. That roof is a shed roof and it all faces north. So it would require some serious racking to put it there. So I kept researching, and there are these projects called community solar, and you can buy into that. So there's a field somewhere that's perfectly south facing. They have, 200 solar panels sitting there waiting for you to say, yes, I want my energy to come from those panels. So that's what I'm doing, actually. Just because there's no option for me to do it at my house. There's a few things that have changed recently. That 4 cent per kilowatt adder is only 1 cent if you have community solar instead of on-site solar. So there's a little bit of a penalty for doing it, but not much. Especially compared to having trees on your lot. That would be a lot of penalty because you wouldn't get any solar production. Yes?
You said something about CFM before. What does that stand
Yes. Cubic feet per minute. Yep. So you take the volume of a space, they depressurize it by blowing air out with a fan out through a doorway, and you're measuring how much air you're able to suck in, basically, through air leakage into that space. So if it was a perfectly sealed box and you turned on a fan, there'd be no air blowing because it's perfectly sealed.
And the other question I had, we have solar panels.
Great.
And I'm wondering when it's going to be a good time to get a backup battery, a Tesla battery. I don't know if it's good now, or do you have to wait a long time for that?
Yep, so there's some information on batteries back there. And did you get one of those sheets that show the upcoming talks? There's a sheet back there also, but there's going to be a presentation coming up at the Southern Vermont Arts Center where they're going to be talking about solar batteries specifically, so you might want to attend that. I am not a solar battery expert. The good news about having batteries for solar is that you can bring in the energy during the day, you can use it during the night, and you don't have to take it from the grid, basically, so you're self-producing. But I guess I talked to Bill today about this. They are working on little groups of batteries, so you would have a community and every house would have a battery, and they would become basically their own power grid. If there was a power outage, those batteries would be sending out electricity, or in some cases, Green Mountain Power could actually pull energy from your battery, drawing it down. So that it's all kind of in this learning phase right now. But yes, there are potentials out there for solar batteries. The real reason to have it would be is if you lose power often and you needed a generator, this would be a good substitute for a generator, or if you were off the grid. But if you're on the grid and you get electricity pretty regularly, you don't so much need a backup battery. Batteries can be expensive.
Well, a lot of us have shingle roofing that needs to be replaced someday. We hear a lot about Tesla experimenting with shingles that will be working as solar panels. What can you tell us? It looks like a shingle roof, it doesn't look like the glass panels.
Right. So the question was, there are other versions of solar panels out there, some of them being look like shingles. And when will they be viable? I don't know. So I've been watching solar evolve over the years. They now have solar roadways, they have solar walkways, they have solar shingles, they have peel and stick solar, rollouts. If you had a standing seam metal roof, you could roll and peel and stick solar to it. The biggest challenge with all of those products is they're not as efficient as the current solar panels are. I'm not saying that 10 years from now that the shingle solar panel versions won't be just as efficient as today's current solar panels, but as of yet, I know they lack in efficiency, and that's the biggest challenge. Some of the old versions of the shingle styles was they actually had individual plugs, so every shingle had to be plugged to the next shingle. So you can imagine, trying to chase back, which plug fell out on a roof. Yeah, I think they've overcome that with a better design now, but those were some of the challenges. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you very much for coming out. I hope you learned something tonight. Those are the dates for upcoming